The most indomitable force in Canadian Conservative politics came to a sudden end this week. Jason Kenney has never lost anything before, not even close. None of his 7 elections as a federal Conservative MP or their accompanying nominations. Not the PC leadership race, not the Wildrose PC merger war, not the UCP leadership race, not his by-election, not the 2019 Alberta election that saw him crowned premier. In all of those contests, his opponents were lucky to get close enough to taste the dust from his heels. Many of his supporters believed he would win the leadership review vote because, well, he always wins. It's a logical fallacy that could be made of the Roman Empire, until it couldn't. Most pundits didn't really take notice that there was anything amiss in Toryland until roughly 9 months ago. But the seeds of Jason Kenney's undoing were planted much earlier. And those seeds were not simply libertarian and populist outrage at his lockdowns and mandatory mask orders and vaccine mandates. Friends make the worst enemies. Soon after winning the UCP leadership, Kenney showed early signs that loyalty was a one-way street for him. Those that would fight for him would be rewarded, but only so long as they were useful at the moment. Over the first 2 years of his leadership, he made a growing list of enemies out of those who had been his friends. Those dissidents were not sore losers from the defeated Brian Jean camp, although the Jean team certainly kept the embers of their fight burning in belief that their man was cheated in 2017. Much of this would be manifest in Take Back Alberta, an organization made up mostly of former Kenney allies. By the fall of 2021, those two camps would form an alliance that would eventually topple the premier. Kenney is a political creature of Stephen Harper's Federal Conservative Party. Despite the Alberta and reform roots of some parts of that party, Alberta politics and Alberta itself are fundamentally different creatures. For most of its history, the base or right flank of the Reform Party and Federal Conservative Party have been social conservatives. Kenney was born of this part of the Conservative coalition and made himself its darling. But federal social conservatives are a remarkably easy group to pacify. With such low expectations of their own political party, most social conservatives are willing to accept a policy statement that can be surmised as, don't make it any worse than it already is now. A little rhetorical respect and a few token policy wins at the margins are normally enough to keep them happy in voting and oftentimes donating and volunteering. When Kenney returned to Alberta to forge and lead the United Conservative Party, he believed that Alberta Conservative Coalition was not fundamentally different than the national one. Maybe a few degrees right of it, but still configured much the same. It's not. Jason Kenney and I argued about this several times, and I clearly lost it. The Alberta Conservative Coalition contains the moderate, urban, and transactional political elements that define the former federal and Alberta Progressive Conservative parties. But on the other side, the Wildrose side, was much more complex and less of a straightforward parallel with the Reform Party. Like the Reform Party, the Wildrose contained social conservatives, but it was hardly the only large and passionate force in it. It contained autonomists, many of whom are now full-fledged sovereigntists and libertarians. Kenney tapped into all of these groups in his unity campaign and subsequent elections as UCP premier. But as premier, he struck a significantly more centrist approach. He believed rhetoric and a few token policy actions were enough to appease these groups, as social conservatives are normally willing to accept at the federal level. But when the Wexit movement exploded in the days following the 2019 federal election that saw Justin Trudeau re-elected, Kenney recognized the discontent and struck up the Fair Deal panel. It signaled that under Kenney's leadership, Alberta would launch a campaign to achieve maximum autonomy in Canada, short of independence, much as Quebec has done. But the report fell short, advocating some distance from Ottawa, but far short of many's expectations. In the rest of Kenney's time as premier, he would only implement a few token items in it. He appointed an Alberta Chief Firearms Officer, which has the potential to do good if they actually do anything with that job, and he called a referendum to remove equalization from the Constitution. But from the beginning, Kenney undercut the leverage of this action by saying that the vote wasn't really about abolishing equalization, but about obtaining leverage to obtain a few minor tweaks on the formula. It left little negotiating leverage to be had with Ottawa when Albertans voted overwhelmingly to scrap it. The Alberta Firsters in his party and voter base expected him to jump on a plane the next day to Ottawa and browbeat Trudeau until he got them the fair deal that he promised them. But he didn't. It was a total and complete silence. Alberta held a referendum on equalization, and its government didn't lift a finger to do anything about it. Kenney's inaction on this front is in no small measure led to the rise on his right flank of the Wild Rose Independence Party. For many who had supported Kenney, they began to see him as a sheep in wolf's clothing. COVID-19 was a disruptive policy force in Alberta, more so than anywhere else in Canada, by far. Repeated lockdowns, police attacking kids for playing hockey, shuttering small businesses with brute force, arresting pastors, raiding churches that refused to close down, forced masking, and mandatory vaccines. Each of these actions by his government outraged libertarians and many social conservatives. They weren't just upset that he broke his promise on some obscure policy like income tax bracket creep. His core supporters saw him as an authoritarian attacking their core liberties. When a rancher in central Alberta held a legal rodeo to protest against Kenney's lockdowns, Kenney told his caucus, "If they are our base, I want a new base." Kenney defended himself, arguing that these measures were lighter and shorter than in other provinces. But therein lays the fundamental problem with Kenney's leadership. Alberta is, at its core, different than other provinces. Ontario Conservatives, by and large, may have been upset with Doug Ford's COVID-19 crackdowns, but the Ontario Conservative culture is, at its core, loyalist Toryism. It's British in character, and it values stability and competency and tradition as its chief virtues. Alberta's conservative culture draws much of its inspiration from the American Revolution, prizing liberty and the restraint of government power as its chief virtues. Kenney would likely have gotten away with his COVID-19 crackdown if he was the premier of any other province in Canada. But he wasn't. He was, and still technically is, the premier of Alberta. Tokenism and rhetoric without substantive action may have pacified social conservatives with low expectations at the federal level for nearly 2 decades of his political career, but it was wholly unsuitable to the much more unruly political culture of Alberta. "I'm not as bad as the NDP" was not a sufficient argument to save his leadership when he raised the hopes and expectations of his supporters to such high levels. There were a few troublemakers in the party. When UCP MLA Todd Loewen publicly called for Kenney's resignation, the premier moved swiftly to have him removed from the caucus. And while he was at it, he also sacked Drew Barnes, who had made increasingly public comments about supporting Alberta independence, or at least strict autonomy. The entire episode was live blogged on the Western Standard, exposing every lurid detail of the confidential meeting. Kenney may have believed that the dissidents were gone, but the very next day, from his caucus and his own office to the Western Standard, the leaks kept coming. His purge failed to remove but only a few of the dissidents in his ranks and allowed for the 2 rebel MLAs to speak more freely than ever. When the UCP met for its annual general meeting in November of 2021, a small group of dissidents put their names forward for election to the party's executive. Kenney's easy victory over them gave him and his team a belief that the rebels were paper tigers. They had lots of talk and increasingly got some press beyond the Western Standard, but they were just a few Brian Jean sore losers and crackpot conspiracy theorists that couldn't mount a serious political threat. So went the reasoning. Little did Kenney know that the executive election at that convention was not a coordinated effort and had next to no organization put into it. Their belief that it was a pitched battle gave them a massive sense of overconfidence that would prove fatal when the real fight came a few months later. When enough rebel constituency associations succeeded in forcing a leadership review vote, Kenney's loyalist executive decided upon an in-person vote in Red Deer. They believed his legendary reputation as a political organizer would give him a massive advantage in having delegates signed up, paid, registered, and transported to and from the polling stations. Unbeknownst to Kenney and his team, Take Back Alberta, mostly his former friends, were prepared and equipped to fight him on his own turf. Their town halls, often several in a single evening, popped up like gophers in different cities, small towns, villages, and even barns in every corner of Alberta. Kenney shrugged this off, claiming that he had the support of broad mainstream conservatives and that, quote, some are angry with a government that promoted safe and effective vaccines. Well, it was a massive missing of the mark. A great many mainstream conservatives were turning on Kenney, and most of those angry at him were not vexed at his support for vaccines. They were miffed at him for forcing vaccines on them against their personal choices, and a great many other authoritarian COVID policies. The annoyance at government COVID-19 policies had already caught fire and sparked the Freedom Convoy, led mostly by Albertans. Soon after its arrival in Ottawa, Erin O'Toole was toppled as federal Conservative leader. The Premier's office at Edmonton eyed that development uneasily, with the first signs of trouble at home. It was not until about a week before the membership cutoff for the Red Deer vote that the Kenney camp appeared to take any notice at all that the threat against them was actually real. In a leaked audio recording of Kenney speaking to his staff, he labeled his opponents as lunatics and right-wing extremists. He said, quote, the lunatics are trying to take over the asylum. He told a group of visible and religious minorities in Northeast Calgary that his opponents were fueled by, quote, racism, hatred, and intolerance. To many, this smacked of Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables and Justin Trudeau's fringe minority with unacceptable views. It was a stunning tactic for a man who hailed himself as the great uniter of conservatives to label those opposing his continued leadership as unfit for participation in party democracy. Kenney's argument that he was the only man who could keep the United Conservative Party united began to appear increasingly out of step with his own words. In the background to all of this, nominations for Kenney-allied MLAs began to open up. Unexpectedly, for them at least, serious challengers emerged running on an anti-Kenney platform, selling huge numbers of memberships. Unsurprisingly, the party brass disqualified these challengers against Jason Nixon and Joseph Schau on the flimsiest of grounds. While this may have protected Kenney's allies against losing their nominations at home, it swelled the ranks with even more angry members looking to settle a score with the Premier. As the membership cutoff approached, 15,000 people registered to vote in Red Deer. From the data I was provided, the result would not have even been close. The Premier would have struggled to break above 30% in that scenario. The in-person vote was designed to play to Kenney's strength as an organizer, but its real effect was to advantage the side with the most motivation. You can guess which side that was. So his executive voted to scrap the in-person vote altogether and move to a mail-in vote. While some accommodation needed to be made for the unprecedented number of voters, they changed the rules of the game entirely to Kenney's favor. They gave Kenney an extra entire month in which to campaign and to put some more distance between the vote and the stench of his unpopular COVID policies. The Kenney campaign was racked by allegations of misdeeds, common among them the bulk buying of memberships in ethnic communities on single credit cards. When we began the live broadcast of the leadership review vote this week, the party promised that the results would have been released sometime between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. I predicted that if the results came early, it would have been good news for the Premier, but a later result would be an omen of doom. Well, the results came late, very late, at 6:40, and for what seems like a pretty good reason. At 51% of the vote, even after favorably rewriting the rules and stacking the deck, it was clearly impossible for Kenney to lead the party forward. No leader of any party in Canada has been able to successfully continue leading a party with less than 70% at a minimum. Kenney had given every indication that he would attempt to hang on to power with even the narrowest margin of victory. Consequences to the unity of the United Conservative Party be damned. Make no mistake, it certainly would have meant the end of the United Conservative Party in Alberta. Much to my surprise, he actually resigned. He was humble and even graceful in a very difficult moment. Well, he sort of resigned. As Don Braid of the Calgary Herald wrote in his column, Kenney intends to stay on as a caretaker leader and premier until his successor is elected. Even running to succeed himself isn't off the table. However, some staff close to him tell me that's pretty unlikely. Kenney is without a doubt the most internally divisive leader any of Alberta's Conservative parties have ever had. His desire to stick around a while longer is probably motivated by a desire to do at least a few last popular things and try to build some kind of positive legacy for posterity. But it would be at odds with the desire of the party to move on and Kenney's own stated goal of putting the past behind them. The two as yet frontrunners for Kenney's successor, Brian Jean and Danielle Smith, are both openly anti-Kenney. There's a good chance they will run against the record of the sitting premier, and it could prove a little awkward for him hanging around the place like a guest who stayed too long after everyone else has left the party. For the good of the United Conservative Party, Kenney should allow his caucus to select an interim leader and the premier to mind the furniture until a full-time replacement is elected. And for God's sakes, pause these phony nomination races until the new leader is elected. Kenney never lost until he did. He was very likely the most celebrated force of political nature in Canada, a man who has never been stopped. Nobody could beat him. He's beat. In all his many battles against the federal Liberals, Brian Jean, the merger refuseniks, he crushed them all. It was only against his former supporters, who once believed that he was their champion, did he finally break. Now Kenney joins the ranks of the three PC premiers that preceded him. A single, incomplete term. Not since Ralph Klein nearly 20 years ago has a Conservative premier even been given the opportunity to stand for re-election. Since then, Ed Stelmach, Alison Redford, and Jim Prentice have only had a single kick at the can. As Kenney used to say of Rachel Notley, one and done. It's entirely possible, and I think increasingly likely, that Alberta's Conservatives are ungovernable as a single, monolithic party. Jason Kenney is only the latest to fail at this unenviable task.